Hey everybody, Mr. Regan here. Now that we've gone over the variables within our experiment that we're going to be testing and how to measure velocity, we're now going to talk about how to create a plan and procedure for what you're going to be doing within our experiment. So we know that as we conduct our experiment, we're going to need to have procedures for how to answer our focus question. Our focus question is, if the same strength force is exerted on two objects, how might their change in velocity be different? The procedures that we create are going to be a step-by-step plan for how to run our experiment, measure our variables, and collect our data to answer this question. Now, our experiment is going to need to use our launcher, our stopwatch, our ping pong balls, our meter stick within our experiment. And you're going to need to use these objects to exert the same strength force on two different objects and measure their velocity with all of those different tools. So we are going to be discussing how we're going to run our experiment and collect our data with these needed materials in our experiment. So when it comes to setting up procedures, okay, we have to ask ourselves, what's going to be that step-by-step plan for how we use the materials, set it up, measure, and collect our velocity data. Whenever scientists set up an experiment, they have four important steps. Step one is figuring out how they're going to set it up. Step two is running that experiment. Step three would be measuring those variables. And step four would be collecting that data to help them explain what's going on or answer those big questions, kind of like our focus and guiding question. So, thinking about our experiment, you need to ask yourself, number one, looking at our four steps here, how are you going to set up your experiment? That's going to be the first set of things you need in your procedures. What are you going to do to set it up before you even begin everything? Next, how are you going to run your experiment and your trials within it? How many times are you going to run your experiment? How many times are you going to try to collect your data using those materials? How many trials will you need to run when it comes to collecting your data? How will you measure velocity as you run your trials? So that would be step three, measuring those variables for our experiment. How are you going to measure velocity using those tools and such? And then last but not least, how will you record and collect your data for your trials? That's step four, collecting your data. Notice each one of these steps, setting it up, running the experiment, measuring the variables, and collecting the data, okay, are all things that are going to show up in your procedures. These are the four things you need. So let's say I was creating an experiment to test the same guiding question. On the left, I have a set of procedures, example one, and on the right, I have a second set of procedures. The first one, you'll notice I have a diagram of a tennis ball and a basketball here. And here are the 5 steps for my experiment. Number one, stand on the chair with these balls. 2, let them go together. 3, measure everything. 4, record the measurements. And 5, do it again 3 more times. So looking at those steps, it's really hard to understand not only what we're doing in the experiment, but also what we're measuring, what to do step by step, and what kind of trials we're going to be doing, and what sort of things I need to record for my data. These procedures are not very scientific, and though they have 5 steps, similar to our 4 steps, these steps are vague and hard to understand what we're doing in the experiment. Now let's look at example 2. Step 1. Set up a chair in an open space within the room with a tennis ball, basketball, and measuring tape and 2 timers. So notice this is the setup portion, step 1, how we're setting it up. Step 2, have one person stand on the chair with the tennis ball in one hand, the basketball in other, holding them out in front of them. Step 3, measure the distance from the bottom of the ball to the floor. Step 4, record the distance both balls will travel in the data table. So notice here we have the setup, like we talked about, setup. And now we're looking at how to run the experiment and how to measure some of the variables that we're going to need. So we're looking at how to run it with somebody standing with both balls in their hand, what we're going to be measuring, and how we're going to record the distance, that specific variable, within the data table. Now, have one person time how long it takes for the tennis ball to hit the floor, another person time how long it takes for the basketball to hit the floor. Okay. Have someone count down from 3 to drop both balls, and then the person's going to start the timer when they drop them and stop it when they hit the ground. So notice, again, how we're running that experiment. We have the setup, we're running the experiment, We even have some things that we're measuring and collecting in terms of data as we go through. Time both balls and record both times in the data table. Complete 3 trials of steps 1 through 7 and record the data in the data table. Last but not least, calculate velocity using distance and time from the data table. So we have 9 steps here. In these 9 steps, we have the 4 components within every good procedure for an experiment. We talk about how to set up the experiment, whether it's the person standing on the chair, how to hold the different tennis balls and golf and basketballs. We talk about how to run it, so when they're going to let go, who's doing what in terms of jobs. We have the measurements, whether it's the distance, whether it's the time, and then we have all the places where we need to collect the data as we go through the experiment for all the different trials. So take a second. Do we understand how to create a detailed step-by-step procedure for your experiment? Do you understand the 4 requirements your experiment must have within those procedures? So how to set up using those 4 procedural needs and how to set up a more detailed set of procedures. If you have questions, reach out. Otherwise, good luck.